delighted to benefit from Professor Boyd and his insights and experience as he shares his perspectives on the transformative potential of civilizational dialogue in building bridges across cultures and contributing to a more just, harmonious, and interconnected world. Apart from Professor Boyd, we have been joined by Professor Omar from Malaysia, and so many other scholars from India and other countries of the world. I welcome you all for this very important event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hamidullah Marazi, for those insightful opening remarks. We now proceed to the keynote lecture, the central intellectual segment of our today's program. May I invite Professor Dr. Andrew J. Boyd to deliver the keynote lecture on reimagining diversity and harmony through civilizational dialogue in today's global context. Prof, you are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you for such a generous introduction and the invitation to be here with you this evening. Professor Hamid, I genuinely feel as if I should be here as a student in a masterclass of dialogue with you rather than offering comments, but I am happy to do so by raising questions and offering some insight into personal experience and into KAICIID's approach. Dr. Farid, also thank you for your coordination and welcome. I begin, I have a title slide I'll bring up, and I begin with a provocative subtitle that can be aimed at all of our approaches. I addressed the question civilizational first, but it applies just as well to religion or culture. And so let me bring that up and I will explain in just a moment. Okay. And can we see okay?
Yes, can.
Wonderful. Thank you. So first of all, I want to say for all, it's a privilege to be hosted by your foundation based in Kashmir. I've not been, but it's not a place that I think needs somebody from the outside to lecture about coexistence. You have centuries of experience and success. Long before any of us were making a profession out of the word dialogue, you had Shaivite mystics, Sufi saints, people revered by Hindus and Muslims alike, engaging in it, living it, practicing it. You've brought a lot to the world with this experience. And so I'm very conscious of speaking about dialogue, not just to a community with this history, but to such an august collection of scholars. As you heard in my introduction, though I spent nearly 15 years in lecturing and as a professor at university and seminaries in Rome, for the last 2 years, my primary work has been with an intergovernmental organization, KAICIID, managing our international fellows program, who are themselves similar to you, mostly scholars, practitioners in dialogue, religious leaders. So I'm offering not just theology today, but also some practical experience. So I do one. So I will speak practically about KAICIID's work and its records. I'll reflect honestly on what the program has taught us, but I will be speaking from my own perspective as a theologian, as a former fellow, and working with KAICIID rather than officially presenting KAICIID in any kind of policy position. I think that's obvious, but it's worth stating at the outset. So any mistakes or failures I have to claim as my own during this presentation. With the title, Reimagining Diversity and Harmony in Today's Global Context, and the relevance of civilizational dialogue is where I offer very respectfully a question to us collectively, or rather to offer some brief insight as to what I hear with civilizational dialogue, and also why KAICIID has chosen the path of interreligious and intercultural dialogue in its title, which might seem a little bit focused on language, but actually has some other effect as well. So I have questions and some observation, and then I hope will inspire some comments and some teaching on your part for me about your experience and your choice of approach in this approach to dialogue. So my thesis is on the screen. I thought about phrasing it as a question, but coming from the North American academic tradition and approach to dialogue, I find it most honest and most respectful to be direct, so that my directness can be challenged directly, dismantled, and together in dialogue we can rebuild together. So the statement, civilizations do not dialogue, but people do, could be a question, do civilizations dialogue? But also, we must admit, clearly also applies to religions or cultures or faith. Religion doesn't dialogue, people do. Culture doesn't dialogue, people do. So when I hear the question of civilizational dialogue, and at the risk of reintroducing something you know better than I do, just an observation on the tradition that I'm aware of and where I hear it, and the challenge that I see there. So the famous Samuel Hunting piece, The Clash of Civilizations in the 90s, as I was in high school and just beginning to engage in the question of interreligious dialogue and intra-religious dialogue. This article in Foreign Affairs called The Clash of Civilizations with a question mark, which most people forget. It exists, put a period instead. He argues that the great conflicts of the coming era would not be ideological or economic, but civilizational, that the fault lines of the future run along the edge of cultures, and in his mind, particularly a Muslim East and a post-Christian West. The counter-reaction, the response in some cases was to realign the cultures or civilizations, and to suggest that it was really religious civilization with Christians, Muslims, Hindus together on one side and aggressive secularism on another. Others proposed a dialogue of civilizations, and that's what I've highlighted here briefly, because this is particularly of interest in the international relations or intergovernmental scene. And this is where the United Nations has picked up the question to propose a dialogue of civilizations, which is put into resolution in the year 2001, not long before the 9/11 attacks in my home country, that also sparked interest in renewed interreligious dialogue. In the years that followed, the UN formed an alliance of civilizations which also offers a fellows program and is probably the closest analog for KAICIID in the intergovernmental international relations space, engaging in dialogue in this way. So the point that I want to raise with all this is that when I hear the phrase civilizational dialogue, it's born as an answer to a thesis of conflict between civilizations, and that it inherits that grammar. So the subject remains the same. Where I see a difficulty with this, or a challenge and an opportunity for correction and information from your own experience, is that both the clash thesis and the dialogue thesis assume coherence in civilization that I think we all know is not always so simple and doesn't really exist. There's no hard limit to the edge of one civilization. Martha Sen gave this a name in his text, Identity and Violence, called it the solitarist illusion. The belief that a human being belongs to exactly one collective identity, and that this collectivity explains their positioning. He's writing as economist and philosopher, not theologian, and he argues that it's false. It's a dangerous perspective to work on this assumption. This might be that of the recruiter or the sectarian. if you reduce someone to just one aspect of their identity, it can be problematic. But again, this could be said not only of civilization, but culture, religion, nationality, some others as well. Edward Said put it a little more sharply in October 2001, and he argued that it wasn't a clash of civilizations, but a clash of ignorance, especially religious ignorance. And here's where we get to the challenge of the language, is that neither civilization nor culture has a mouthpiece. So if we say that Islamic East and Christian or post-Christian West are in dialogue, what actually happens is you might have an imam from Jordan sitting down across from a municipal officer from Portugal. That imam would be a father, perhaps an Arabic speaker. Maybe he has a bad knee. Maybe he has particular views about the World Cup. And the municipal officer might be a Catholic, a former Catholic, or an atheist with a Catholic grandmother, a bureaucrat, somebody who's more concerned about the housing budgets. But neither of them is a civilization. Both are people engaged, part of civilization, part of religion, part of culture. So all of our identities have these multi-sectional realities. It would add the person most likely to be flattened sometimes by too much emphasis on the large-scale dialogue, civilizational or cultural, for example, is not the outsider so much as the internal dissenter, the reformist, the dialogue practitioner, maybe the woman theologian, the minority within the minority, member of a small school of thought or sect. So we are always asking then who is speaking on behalf of culture or civilization, who's not present, or who's speaking on behalf of religion. But that's only one way to read this phrase, I think. That's an abstract use where civilizations become billiard balls, they become named at 30,000 feet, they collide and converse on a global stage, but when you get right down to the practice of it and the practicality and the local application, it's not very clear who's in dialogue. So that becomes a borrowing of Huntington's grammar, even when it means to oppose his question. But there's a second rooted use, and this is where I suspect your foundation's experience comes from, and I'd be happy to hear more, is that civilizations, not meant in an abstract sense, but in the very particular place with a particular history, with particular people who have learned and lived and loved together, but also experienced conflict together. You don't have to leave Kashmir to know that. You've got figures like Lal Ded, Deeds, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly, Nundrishi, coming from different traditions, engaging in dialogue, respected by everybody, two people across communities, one valley, speaking one language, and I have too much to learn about them and their legacy. This is not an abstraction, this is real people in a real place with real effect and real consequence. So this is how I understand civilizational dialogue from your perspective, but I hope to learn more. So when I say that people dialogue, this is true of civilization, of religion or culture. But it's also a question of putting our money where our mouth is. It's a budget question. I've attended some of the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations events. You tend to have big summits that bring together national leaders who all need equal time to speak. And in fact, there's very little dialogue happening. You can develop a beautiful statement. You can have a great picture from the event. You can make sure that everybody's present, but it lacks a certain something in that experience. And then what happens afterwards sometimes is that when participants go back to the local village, the local school, the local religious house, nothing much has changed. But if we focus on the people engaged in dialogue, I think this is your experience as well. You build something much less photogenic, perhaps, much less likely to end up in the news on a global scale. But you build a curriculum, you train individuals, you give people real experience of each other, maybe a small amount of money to fund a project. And this has become something practical that they've done and that they've learned. And then that relationship can be built over years or decades. And then we can measure whether a particular institution or community has changed, what it does, what it teaches, what it says. So I'm not saying the big scale events or the photographic opportunities are without worth. I've planned a few, certainly. I think we all have. They confer legitimacy, and that's a real resource. But I'm saying that that should be the tip of the iceberg, the ceiling, not the foundation of our work. And so I think that in this field of interreligious dialogue, along with peace education and intercultural dialogue, intercivilizational dialogue, temptation may always be there to go for the right photo-friendly moment, rather than the less glamorous, difficult work. And again, this is from my experience and perspective. I'm not suggesting that it's one way to do it. So if reflecting on the context, so to today's global context, as asked in the title, what has actually changed? I want to pull out these three pressures. And I don't think they will sound apocalyptic, but I think that they're real and they need to be addressed. And I think this is a question for all of us. First, polarization, which everybody's aware of and everybody feels, but we have to acknowledge that it's now something that is often engineered and not simply inherited. It's not passive. So as I was growing up in the 1980s in North America, I always had the impression that prejudice was, especially kinds of prejudice about race or particular cultures, was something handed down as a negative legacy of history. And there's some truth to that. That certainly exists. But I think the contemporary machinery that we deal with is different. There are whole economies that reward emotional intensity and conflict as opposed to dialogue and peace. We know this. And it's not just the obvious choices of the economies of war, but also the economies of communication and media and the internet can have this challenge. So it's not that stories need to be invented, but real conflicts can be exaggerated and created into problems far worse than they actually should be. Second, this challenge of religion being instrumentalized, sometimes in two different directions. So one, by political actors who have no particular religious commitment or genuine belief, but recognize a useful vocabulary or a useful identity marker that they can take advantage of. On the other hand, at least in my experience in Europe and North America, it's very common that you can have religion treated as almost an embarrassment by secular institutions, whether governments or universities or international bodies, and that the decision has been made to treat religion as a purely private, quiet matter, and hope that it fades away and we can ignore it politely, which results in a lack of competence to engage in it. And I think we all can think of multiple examples where foreign policy failures have been largely due to an ignorance of religion. So when religion arrives in the middle of a policy issue, as it usually does, these institutions who are there to find solutions have no way to engage it. So religious illiteracy in policy circles becomes a security risk. There's a great phrase I've overheard in interreligious dialogue over the years, that is, if you don't want religion to be part of the problem, it must be part of the solution. I don't think this is new for anyone in this call, but it is a lesson that our friends and neighbors may need. Finally, diversity is moved indoors. And what I mean by that, for much of the 20th century, if it was dealt with at all, religious difference was treated as a foreign policy issue. And this goes back to this framing of the clash of civilizations as well. But now it's for most of us a very local, very immediate neighborhood concern. And for some of us, this was always the case. It's a classroom where you have 20 students from 10 different language groups. A hospital where a chaplain must serve 4 completely different religions. It's the newsroom that engages with this reality. So the work has moved. It's no longer the summit, but the seminary. It's no longer the official diplomatic communique, but the teaching syllabus. It's no longer the official envoy, but the teacher or the local actor. Here I could admit something on behalf of my own approach and our own approach to interreligious dialogue. For a long time, interreligious work has rested often implicitly on the contact hypothesis. Even in my own current program, this is cited in our foundational concept note. This is the idea that if we simply bring people together who are different, prejudice will decline. Get the Hindu and the Muslim, or the Catholic and the Protestant together in a room, and just being in proximity will lead to understanding and care for each other, and contact will do the rest. But that's not what the originator of the hypothesis, Gordon Allport, actually said. When he formulated this in the 1950s, he put 4 conditions: equal status between the groups, shared common goals, cooperation rather than competition, and support of an institution or an authority. If you take those 4 away, or most of those 4, the contact does not necessarily reduce prejudice or bias, and sometimes even increases it. If we look at 2 environments where this kind of contact happens most, or conflict happens most, arising out of differences in religion, culture, and others, the internet is one, and it has none of these. It's not meant to. It's a machine for competition and exposure, and can be a resource, but it doesn't provide any of these guardrails. And sometimes our own interfaith events, especially one-off events, without building relationship and long-term dialogue, can also lack these 4. And this is something I think a room full of people who have been doing this work know well. So dialogue, I see, and KAICIID sees, as something to be taught, structured, and resourced, not just an event, not just a convening, which is why I really appreciate the series you've put together here, and the continued work that goes from them. The question of diversity, I like the phrasing of Diana Eck, who I had the privilege to meet once, is that diversity is a fact that we live with and live in. Pluralism, rightly understood, and I'm aware of challenges with that word as well, but it can be an achievement. It's what we do with the diversity that exists. So if we reimagine diversity, at first when I was drafting, I was tempted to go into the invisible differences that diversity sometimes ignores. But really, I think to remain focused on our question is that the reimagining diversity is required to move from a description to a competence, to a skill that we can build. So stopping about who is in the room, and which is about representation, which is important. But then we need to have it become, what can they do when they leave the room? How do we take dialogue with us, and what do we change? So this brings me briefly to just sharing a little bit about KAICIID. the King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, and how we approach the question and how we approach dialogue practically. And again, if you believe in the idea of people doing dialogue, that becomes a center to our question. And yet, we are institutional and we act institutionally. So KAICIID is unique and a bit unusual. We are an intergovernmental organization established by international treaty between states, started in Vienna, now headquartered in Lisbon. And we do have a council of parties representing those states. But we are also a multi-faith organization engaged in interreligious dialogue. We have a board of directors representing 5 of the world's religions: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism. And the board of directors sets the direction for our programmatic work, while the states arrange the funding and the practical support in the background. So for us, the question of civilizational dialogue gets placed within the institutional context rather than staged outside. These are disagreements within our governing bodies, not on an event stage. They're around the table that actually signs the budget and makes the practical decisions. To be perfectly honest, the way the organization works is slow, it's frustrating, can be very difficult sometimes, but that's also sort of the point, because if we find interreligious disagreement easy, then we probably haven't done it right in its entirety. So I mentioned at the beginning some questioning about the terms that we use, and also some insight, not just to how I hear the word intercivilizational, but also how KAICIID ended up on its 2 preferred terms of interreligious and intercultural, while acknowledging that all 4 of these and some others have contributed a lot, and it's not that we're meant to be exclusive or preaching that this is the only way to do it. And the reason I do this is not to be pedantic, I hope, but that the terminology itself is the argument. As I said, it's in our full name. There was serious discussion about, are we an interfaith, multi-faith, intercivilizational, intercontextual, interconvictional, what are we? So I've already discussed why the understanding of civilizational didn't quite work for our center. Similarly, interfaith, we read as faith is what each individually believes, and that's important if we believe that people dialogue. But faith has no institution, no curriculum, no succession plan, no authorized speaker. It's what the individual formulates from their religious or philosophical belonging. And so as an institution at the international level, we've chosen to engage institutionally religious institutions, because religions have texts, authorities, systems, even if decentralized and less formal in some cases. And there's a process of formation that can look very different across religions, but that's where we engage, especially through the Fellows Program, is in religious formation, or formation for religious leadership. Intercultural was chosen rather interestingly, and sometimes confusingly, but I think it has a very interesting story. So we exist because of an encounter between Pope Benedict XVI and King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia in the years following 9/11 and this clash of civilizations conversation. And if you remember, 2008 was a particularly interesting year, well, really the 2006 to 2008. In 2008, Pope Benedict wrote a short letter to an Italian philosopher, which was published as the preface to Marcello Pera's book. And he said something that took a lot of people off guard in this field, especially the perhaps some of his own staff, that interreligious dialogue in the strict sense of the word is not possible. And he was referring to basically dialogue outside, for Christians, dialogue outside of Christianity or possibly Judaism. But he wasn't being dismissive. Anybody who knows him, he was a very serious theologian. But he argued that dialogue about basic religious option or fundamental theology cannot really be conducted without a common theological framework, without each party placing their faith in parenthesis. And I think the most important thing in dialogue is that we don't really do that. We can't bracket the faith entirely and engage in dialogue. So he argued what is possible and necessary is intercultural dialogue, that we work out together cultural consequences of those religious commitments. And this isn't just rhetoric. He made these changes himself once he became Bishop of Rome. He effectively folded the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue into the Pontifical Council for Culture and sent the former prefect of that council as nuncio to Egypt. And it was during that period where the Council for Interreligious Dialogue no longer existed effectively, that the Regensburg Address, the pushback to that, the Common Word Declaration, which for a year went unresponded to by the Vatican, all happened because of this lack of a Council for Interreligious Dialogue. But 2 years later, in 2008, he has this letter, and a couple months after that, a couple months earlier than that, we had King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz meet with King Juan Carlos in Spain at the World Conference on Dialogue in Madrid. And this deliberately seated not just members of the so-called Abrahamic faiths, but Hindus, Buddhists, Shinto, Confucius, and others at the table for the conversation. Within classical Islamic frame, as I understand it, as an outsider, engagement with the al-Kitab, with the people of the book, has a long and settled grounding, but engagement with other traditions has sometimes been problematic, certainly in some areas. And the king's advisors struggled with that at his request. And so intercultural for them as well became the register that allowed interreligious dialogue beyond the people of the book recognized within the Islamic tradition. At least without requiring a theological determination of other religions at the time. So now you have these two very different figures, a Bavarian Catholic theologian famous for his exacting orthodoxy, and the religious establishment of Saudi Arabia coming to the same conclusion for the same basic structural reason. And for us, in effect, this became the framing of our mission and our mandate. It's not relativism, but it's opposite. A relativist would reject the idea of the disagreement anyway, doesn't need the intercultural register. And this is exactly what our founding documents say, is that this conference in Madrid was recalled by name. The meeting of the Pope and the King was recalled by name, alongside the UN General Assembly's high-level meeting on promotion of dialogue in November of 2008. So these are the founding moments for us, for KAICIID. And so landing on these terms of interreligious and intercultural dialogue together, not one without the other, becomes our mandate. It also is not meant to be a way to treat non-Abrahamic religions as somehow second class or less than, but that's a genuine criticism that gets heard sometimes because of this historical framing. Certainly isn't our approach, but we could talk about that a little bit later if it's helpful. But all of this brings us back to where I began, that interreligious dialogue is hard, also that people are the ones who are expected to dialogue, not culture or civilization. And it's hard because it's worth doing and worth doing right. I think you're here because you know that. Very briefly, the International Fellows Program, the program I work primarily with, is not a conference. It's a year-long capacity building professional development designed for people who are mid-career religious leaders, educators, formators of future religious leaders, sometimes some policymakers. We basically offer a course of training, about 200 contact hours, 3 weeks of that in person in different parts of the world, some online asynchronous classes, some online sessions together. We offer a small grant for people to put into practice what they've learned about dialogue. We tried to target mostly people who are not already greatly experienced in interreligious dialogue, but who would benefit from it, whose institution would benefit from it, and add them to a network where we connect them with people already experienced in the field. And then they go and train others and multiply that. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary of the program in December. Over those 10 years, we've trained 555 fellows from about 100 countries, so 96 nationalities, but 106 countries by where they live, and 17 distinct religions or religious identities, and that's not even counting movements or denominations like Sunni or Catholic or Orthodox Jew, etc. Those are just the major religions. We've offered over 700 grants to our fellows over the years, totaling over 1.5 million euro. And this is not meant as any kind of brag, but just for frame of reference. Because what we've learned in that decade of this program, even though I wasn't here managing it for that entire time, are that we have challenges and reflections that we need to make on those challenges. And I think these can be challenges for all of us. So one is a drift. The Fellows Program very clearly was formed to address formators of future religious leaders. And over the years, we've expanded to include much more broadly religious actors, community leaders, policymakers, intergovernmental officials, youth workers. All of those efforts are good, and each decision seemed very reasonable at the time, but after a decade, we found we've drifted a bit far from our original purpose. So we are reflecting now how to deal with that drift. Do we reorient on the original purpose or accept a new direction? I think every institution that's been at this work for a long time has the same challenge and question, has to ask. We reflect ourselves every once in a while. The biggest challenge for me, I think my lifelong problem, and if you have a solution, please tell me, is how to dialogue with those who don't see the value of dialogue. And I think this is where many of us might experience. Sometimes it's easier to dialogue with the person who is also interested in dialogue from the other religion or the other culture or the other civilization than with our co-religionist or our neighbor or a family member who sees no point in dialogue. I think if we can figure out how to really engage people in dialogue who most need it, there's a Nobel Prize to be had. So we've got work to do. And the third is very structural and practical. I think the irony of interreligious dialogue I've learned is that interreligious dialogue organizations rarely dialogue with each other. So this is a great opportunity. We have similar missions. There's finite funding, finite human resources. It's a good problem. It means more people are interested. The field has grown, but it means coordination among us becomes part of the work itself. So it's helpful to name this honestly, figure out how we deal with it, how we complement each other, share resources, work together as much as possible to have the greatest impact, and hold ourselves to account on all this. Just one example of what we've done to reflect on what we've achieved and also what our challenges are. We just conducted a lengthy external evaluation of our program. We got the results in March, processing through a management response now, and we'll hopefully have a public statement of direction to share later this year of how we're going. So let me just conclude with four propositions, and then open to questions or responses, and then questions. In answer to the question of the title, how do we reimagine this? I would suggest, one, we need to move from, you may have assumed many of us have done this in many ways, move from representation to competence, not just who is at the table, but what they actually do, what's the impact, what did they do with it after they leave? How do they transfer this skill set for dialogue and for investment in the other? Invest not just in the leaders, not just the high-profile person. We need them. They have leverage. They can make decisions. But make sure we're working with the educators, the formators, the people responsible for the next generation in general, but also the next generation of leaders. Many of you at the table are exactly these people. 3, find ways to institutionalize this commitment to dialogue, not just the individual enthusiast. It's often the most unromantic part of dialogue, but the most necessary. And keeping in mind that dialogue does not always need to lead to agreement. In fact, if we are true to ourselves and committed to our belief genuinely, we won't usually come out of dialogue agreeing with each other on the most profound beliefs that we differ on, but we will understand each other better, and we can be true to our whole selves as we engage in dialogue without being dishonest to someone else. And here's the objection, this is the challenge, is I suspect every one of us has heard from within our own community at some point, phrased in our own language, the idea that dialogue itself is somehow a betrayal of our identity, or that to sit with the other is already to concede something important, that the faithful, the believers, should protect the truth by refusing the conversation. And that's not a stupid objection. It's not always made in bad faith. It deserves a real answer. Because devotion is not an obstacle to dialogue. It's actually the whole point. Dialogue in which everybody already has revised their convictions costs nobody anything and changes nothing. You know, I think that it's important for us to engage in dialogue so honestly that we can disagree profoundly with people whom we respect and love. And this is where the work is. But we know this. Harmony is not unison. It's not uniformity. Unity is not uniformity either. It's a beautiful title. The vision of harmony comes from music, where dissonance is not a failure, but an instrument. It's not one single note carried by it all, but a diversity that works together. We know this. So let's be clear that we're not asking anyone to leave quiet some part of themselves, especially not their religious conviction, but to bring it into dialogue and into harmony with the others. So to answer that challenge that I just proposed a moment ago, that we hear, is the reason that I chose this motto, which I've borrowed. It's not my original formulation. The truth has no fear of dialogue. If you believe firmly, if you're a real believer, if you have faith, there's no fear of dialogue, because dialogue costs nothing. Dialogue might challenge an empty formulation or a weak faith. I've borrowed this, as I said, from the ecumenical patriarch in the Orthodox Christian tradition, Bartholomew of Constantinople. In 2010, he wrote an encyclical to other Orthodox believers, where he said that the church does not fear dialogue because truth is not afraid of dialogue, and that truth has never been endangered by dialogue. And I bring this up because I just ask you to notice who he was talking to. He was talking internally. He wasn't doing interreligious dialogue. He was talking not even ecumenically to other Christians, but to his own people. There were critics inside his own communion who had denounced engagement even with other Christians, as heresy in itself, that someone to enter into dialogue was having to surrender something. And his answer is not sentimental, but a challenge to show what doctrine has changed or been abandoned because of dialogue, and there isn't one. I think we all have variations and versions of this. So in the end, the person who fears dialogue is not defending the truth, they're confessing a doubt. And so I think we all know from our experience that if your truth is strong, dialogue costs you nothing. The truth is not something we own, not something we can lose. Bartholomew wrote this to his own people. I think we can all write it and reflect on it for ourselves. So with that motto, with that phrase as a guidepost and an offer for where we go with this, I can only say thank you for the opportunity, for the time. I hope it sparked something you can teach me and respond. And if you want to know more about the Fellows Program, we can talk about that too. I hope this is what you had in mind, and I hope to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much once again, Professor Anju, for your comprehensive and thoughtful presentation. We now open the floor for the question and answer session. So participants are kindly requested to raise their hand or put their question in chat box so that we may entertain the questions. So anyone?
So I will just mention that we have Professor Sharmista Chatterjee also. She's a very renowned professor of English literature from Malia University. So we are very fortunate that she has been also one of our advisors, and also Dr. Siddharth ji from Maharashtra. And we have also Dr. He is from basically Afghanistan, but she's stationed in Malaysia. So we have many people from different countries, and we hope that we can engage in a very fruitful dialogue in this way. Professor Sharmista Chatterjee, you may just also enlighten us about some of the aspects which have been discussed.
Thank you, sir. I was in fact, thinking of clarifying a few things and also asking you certain questions, sir. So you were brilliant. First of all, let me tell you, very, very thought-provoking lecture. So I had 3 clarifications. One, you seem to say and suggest that academic exchanges could also be a part of religious dialogues, if I'm not mistaken, sir. Like say collaborations, like say exchanges. So and at the institutional level, sir. So am I right, sir? Like say, suppose, sir, my subject is English. So say if I am to collaborate in English literature language, through that, sir, do I really bring in a dialogue? So that was one question, sir. The second one was a clarification, sir, that rather an observation, sir. So we seem to talk only about the major religions of the world, like say definitely say Christianity, Islam, and you also mentioned Hinduism, sir. But say, sir, religious dialogues, could that also mean retrieving, some of the lesser known, indigenous, local, very local religions which are being deliberately, I would say, marginalized, sir? So this was the second one, sir. And the third, which I found very, very interesting, that you said that dialogues definitely would be, again, indefinite, definitely indefinite, because they refuse closure. Yes, they are a process rather than a product. So, sir, if you could kind of elaborate on this, the last point especially, because if we say that it's a process, then we are also trying to say that there actually may not be dialogues. As you had also mentioned, the Pope of course, referring to that there may not be dialogues. So if it's always a process, then can we really achieve that peace, which becomes a sort of a chimera, sir? I hope I was. So these are the three things, sir. And you were brilliant, let me tell you. One of the most thought-provoking lectures, sir. So that was from my end. Yeah.
Thank you,
So if you
Professor.
could clarify.
Very kind of you to say, first of all, and really great observations and questions. Just to go in order, certainly academic dialogue. I think there are many ways to do dialogue. I think we all know this from our experience, that just dialogue is never just talking to each other. It's not just the formal dialogue of religious leaders, but there are many different forms and approaches. So certainly the academic piece is important. So I mean, that's why we're here. I think that very interesting dialogues have happened in my experience when not just the theologians or not just the religious studies scholars, but everybody from the literature professors to the fashion and design instructors to the business school have asked the question of how to engage in interreligious, intercultural dialogue within their field. Literature is, I think, an easy one. There's such a wealth of stories to be told that can engage one another, but also stories of dialogue. I mean, I think you could have some really brilliant dialogue on the question of religious dialogue, interreligious dialogue related to English or to literature in general. I think there's a lot that could be done there. I think that's very important. Also because people will access this in different ways. For some people, religion is primarily a truth claim, but for others, religion is culture, and for others, religion is family history and tradition, and for others, it's primarily about the kind of food that you enjoy most. I mean, there's a lot of ways we engage our own religion and our faith, and so absolutely, I think it's important, and there's a lot that could be done there very creatively. I appreciate your comment about the major religions, and also you did not say this, but I was thinking it of myself. I apologize perhaps for the use even of the word Hinduism, knowing full well the history of where that term comes from, trying to brush such a broad stroke over the many different local belief traditions of Sanatana Dharma, and that's also like Abrahamic religions, or a lot of the terms we use so easily in religious studies have so many challenging aspects to them as well. So I do want to point out that we have among our fellows are represented many different traditions that are collectively piled under Hinduism, and we also have fellows of a number of less well-known religions or sparsely populated religions. So just a couple of weeks ago, I had a panel of our fellows, including the son of the Samaritan high priest, a Yazidi from Iraq, a Druze from Syria, and Baha'i from Argentina. There are some religions we don't have present among our fellows, but we do have some indigenous religions of the Americas, including Anishinaabe and Mayan. Also of Asia, we have Sunda Wiwitan, fellow from Indonesia, and I know we've got a couple others. So it's always been important to us to not only look at the major religions that we have on our board of directors, but really all the indigenous, traditional, and smaller religions. We're really trying to approach dialogue as diversely as possible in a genuine way. And I think even before I started working with the program, I think that was one of the strengths, is that often my experience of interreligious dialogue was it's the same familiar faces that you hear from. And this was a place I found engagements with religions I had never encountered, people from countries that I rarely had opportunity to talk to. I was just on a committee call with an Iranian scholar earlier today, and I think of the tension of my home country and his, and yet how we can continue our work together. So I think, yeah, I think it's very important. But we also have, because of how we're placed, we also have a lot of people who come out of non-religious traditions who are engaging this from an international relations or international law and human rights perspective. And that creates a whole new dialogue of vocabulary that I'm not used to dealing with as a religious academic background. So that's also been very interesting. And then finally, just briefly, in one sense, true dialogue is never ending, but on the other sense, that's not great for budgets and grants and projects. And so I think a dialogue can have specific pieces. You can schedule a dialogue that has a timeline and a schedule and agenda. I don't think the result is always going to be an agreement on something. But I think you can look at results and have genuine impact. And one of our challenges, I think anybody doing this institutionally knows, is how do we measure that impact as we want to report to our funders, our board of directors, our partners. You know, how do you measure the impact of something like better religious understanding and cooperation is a challenge for all of us. But yeah, I think you can design dialogue in a way that you do have a specific goal in mind or a specific group for a specific time, as long as you acknowledge that's always within this greater long-term development. So thank you. Really great questions, observations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think we have one more question from
Irfan Saab, he wants to ask question. Dr. Irfan Saab.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Walaikum assalam.
Am I audible to all?
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, I'm driving, but I want to ask a question, sir. Why at the first time do we need to have a dialogue? And secondly, does it simply create a sense of tolerance and acceptance in a society? Or we should more focus on critical thinking and let people know that if we shun our prejudices and prior preconceived thoughts and have our brain unconditioned, then only dialogue is possible. Thank you, sir.
Yes. You know, to the second part, I think context will demand a lot. Not every context where dialogue is happening or needs to happen is the same, right? This is very clear. I think if you're in a context where people are actively shooting at one another, your immediate goal might be tolerance, might be a ceasefire and then tolerance. If you're in a context where tolerance is already happening, then you can question the word tolerance and say, well, this is just, tolerance still implies a power imbalance. You know, I as a majority or I in power tolerate you, the minority or the different or the other, still implies that I can choose not to. And a dialogue can call us to a deeper relationship of mutual understanding. And so, yeah, that's where I think the critical thinking is absolutely necessary, but also the full presence of ourself, of our full identity. Genuine dialogue will never ask us to leave our religion at the door or our faith at the door, some part of what we hold to be true outside the room. Instead, it celebrates that, invites us to put it into contact with the other, acknowledging that if done well, you don't start a dialogue the first time you bring people together. You don't bring Christians, Muslims into a room for the first time and say, okay, Trinity, discuss. That doesn't work. You have to build up to the difficult conversation, but you don't want to ignore it either. So yeah, I think
then shall we focus on the commonalities in that case? What are the common terms?
I think you start with the commonalities, but I don't think you end with the commonalities. I think you start with the commonalities so you can build the relationship, so you can trust each other when you start addressing the differences, especially the fundamental, profound differences of faith. and or to discuss the history of conflict, if that's part of the context.
Right.
And
What?
that's why it's a long
Yes,
process.
please continue.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
what one can get from all this is that nobody is going to actually believe that I am wrong or others can also be right, unless and until we develop this thing that there can be more than one right options. Then the dialogue will process. Because you see, in your psychology, at the back of your mind, it's always your superior complexity that has been actually taught to you from the very childhood, that your religion or your ideology is altogether superior and exactly right than others. So to simply detach you from yourself, to dethrone yourself from that very seat is actually important. That's what I have felt, and that's my opinion.
Yeah. I think it's important that we're true with ourselves, where we're situated, what our background is, what our culture and time and history have imposed upon us from the outside. The contextualization of our position is important. I think, but this is also what I mean by being true to ourselves. I can walk into a room as a Christian, engage in dialogue without ever letting go of the fact that I believe in Christ as Son of God, knowing and respecting that the people I'm in dialogue with disagree with me on this most fundamental religious question, but that disagreement doesn't change the reality of the dialogue or the respect for one another, or at least at an intellectual, there's the possibility, I may find out that I was wrong. We may all find out we were wrong. We may discover that in fact the Mendeans were the only correct ones the whole time. There will be some surprises, I think, for all of us, but the reality is, I believe because I have reason to believe, and so do you, and it's celebrating that belief together, I think, is the real value. Because I have learned so much from my experience of dialogue with people who disagree with me about some of the most important things. And some of my most beloved friends are from completely different traditions. And so I think I think we all benefit from it. But yeah, it's a tightrope between, you don't want to fall into relativism, say none of it matters, but you don't want to be an absolutist and say, well, I'm not going to listen to anyone either.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that I just want to add one point, if I'm allowed. Basically, when we just get into dialogue, we understand our own weaknesses and shortcomings.
Yeah.
Because when we are just having preconceived notions about other people, and that creates a lot of problems. But when we come close to people, many things get in themselves dispelled. So in this way, without dialogue, there is no possibility of understanding or living in a peaceful manner in a society. So there is no other way alternative to dialogue at all. And I always say that if there is no dialogue, there is deadlock. And deadlock will lead us nowhere. We need to have dialogue. And everywhere, in everyday life, we have dialogue at our families, with our friends, colleagues in society. So dialogue is it is a way of life. So, but when we call it a civilizational dialogue, it is more than theological or religious dialogue. It can be on other items where we may not believe on the basis of theology, but there may be some concerns, common concerns. Maybe the dialogue in action. So we want to just solve some problems which humanity is facing, or marginalization of the people and whatever it is. So we can help them to come out from that without imposing our belief system on them. So in this way, dialogue has to be there always, whatever the conditions for dialogue are there, and there is no way out than dialogue, I think so.
Thank you so much, Professor Razi. So if we have any question, maybe entertain one more question if we have time, I think, because of time constraints.
Dr. Umar Shaib, we may have some question. Dr. Umar Shaib from Malaysia.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, thank you so much, Prof, for the wonderful lecture and It is indeed insightful and really timely. And still on this issue of religious dialogue, which to some extent I really confuse. As you just mentioned that religious dialogue not necessarily to be just physical discussion. So in this situation, for example, now sometime we just open or make a table discussion that we can do it physically so that everyone can understand what someone's ideas about this religion. Because sometimes it was last time I met one professor, which when we were discussing about religion, to what I know, it is just all about understanding. So without this physical discussion or dialogue, so Prof, in what way do you think that is more suitable that we can make religious discussion?
I missed something in the last sentence. If we can make religious discussion.
Yeah. What I mean, if it is, if we cannot just proceed with the physical discussion, so which kind of suitable way that we can employ at least to make one understand that, for example, I'm just defending my religion and someone also defending his religion, and how we can harmonize our understanding.
I think a couple of different ways in my experience, and again, everybody in the room, I think, has something to add to this. So I think on one hand, in terms of if you have a formal dialogue, a conversation about religious teaching or about personal faith, and those are two related but separate things, you can certainly design the conversation. One is to present, I can present on behalf of Catholic Christianity, our teaching, our tradition. I can present on myself, my personal belief and faith and spirituality. I can share stories that have impacted me and relationships that have affected me. We can work together to respond to a common need, a common situation in our community, in our country, in our world. Whether it's a disaster or a social civic program, or there's a wide range of possibilities there too. I think living together, some of us grow up in contexts where we never meet somebody from a different religion until we're adults. And some of us grow up where, you've got a Muslim family here, a Hindu family next door, and a Buddhist after that. And, and you see each other at school or in the commons or the park or, at the grocery store. But if you don't have that context anyway, sometimes it has to be created. So one thing we do with our fellows, for example, is we deliberately include religious site visits in our training sessions. And we try to do our training sessions in different parts of the world, so that many times I've had a fellow come up to me and say, I've never set foot in a mosque before. And this was or a synagogue or a church or, whatever. And this was the first time. But I've also had, fellows from the Arab region, when we go to Malaysia or Indonesia or Bangkok and Thailand, and we enter a mosque there, their own religious tradition, but they find a completely different architecture or a different approach to community or different dress. And sometimes that intercultural aspect of the dialogue becomes just present. When I moved to Rome, I had already been studying intra-religious and interreligious dialogue for over a decade. I'd been in ministry, I'd been teaching in the local context. But it was the first time that in the community I lived in, one of my housemates was Muslim from Ghana. And it was the first time I encountered somebody making just ritual ablutions on a day-to-day basis for prayer. So as we walked to the bathrooms, and I saw him washing himself, I realized this is something I've read about, it's something I knew about, but I'd never seen it in practice until we lived in the same building under the same roof. And you know, one morning at breakfast, we were sitting and we had an imam from Bosnia, we had an Israeli archaeologist, and we had myself, a Christian from North America, and we began to discuss circumcision somehow. And you know, this is not going to be an academic topic. It's not going to come up in most breakfast conversations. And yet we all learned something about each of our traditions and approaches that we also had very personal you know, connection to. So I think there's really such a wide variety of approaches, topics, modes of dialogue. It's not just talking to one another, but you know, there's so much we can do together, we can live together, we can celebrate together. And ultimately, I think all of it teaches us something about our own faith. Just my one last thought. I remember a conversation with a Turkish Muslim scholar I was working with on a project, and just randomly in the middle of the project, he said, "Oh, Andrew, you want me to become a Christian, don't you?" And I thought, well, you know, that's not why I'm here. I'm not a proselyte. I'm not proselytizing. I'm not trying to convert people. I'm genuinely interested in dialogue. But before I could say anything, he continued and he said, "And that's perfectly fine. That's your religion. I respect it. I want you to become a Muslim because it means so much to me. Of course, I want to share it with you, my good friend." And I thought that's exactly right. You know, that's part of dialogue, is to share what we see as truth. And you know, I'm not there to convert somebody, but I'm happy to share what I believe. So yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to our approach, our attitude, and a skill set that has to be learned. I hope that helps or inspires better ideas anyway.
Thank you so much, Prof.
Yeah.
Thank you so much once again, and thank you to all participants for your insightful questions and reflections. I think because of time constraints, we may not entertain some other questions at the moment. I would like to invite Professor Dr. Naseem Gulsab, Vice President of the HCDHF, to deliver a vote of thanks, acknowledging our distinguished speakers, participants, and the organizing team. Meanwhile, if anyone has any question, they may email us directly or to Professor Andrew, so that you may get reply. Thank you, Professor Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Farid, for inviting me for this closing talk. At the outset, I'm highly thankful to Professor, the keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Andrew, for not only deliberating on reimagining diversity and harmony through civilizational dialogue in today's global context, which was the theme of this talk, but in addition, he introduced KAICIID in front of all of us. So thank you for deliberating on the theme and giving us the introduction of the KAICIID. I'm also thankful to Professor Hamid Naseem Rafiabadi, Professor Hamidullah Marazi, the President of Huma Civilizational Dialogue and Harmony Foundation, General Secretary Dr. Farid Malik, the Founding Director, Mr. Ashaisa. I'm also thankful to all the participants, particularly who put some efforts in making this talk some lively. Mr. Omar Shoaib, Sharimasta Chatterjee, Irfan Dal Sahab. We had many friends who attended this lecture online, and many of my colleagues were present here in my department. Dr. Nazrul Islam, Dr. Bilal, Dr. Ishfaq, Dr. Mudassir. I'm thankful to everyone. Many of my students were also here. Dr. Sadia is now has become doctor, Dr. Mushtaq, Dr. Bilal, and all the presents online. We have Mudassir Mondar, Gulfshan Paveen, Zuha Shai, a budding scholar of Kashmir, Nabila Hassan, Siddharth John Daly, Naqib Ahmadi, and all those who participated and made this event successful. As we are already late, we had to conclude it at 8, but it's now 8:23. So I think that it's enough. Thank you, Dr. Farid. Thank you, Professor Hamidullah Marazi, and thank you, the keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Andrew.
Thank you so much for your kind words. As we conclude today's program, I would like to express once again our sincere gratitude to our keynote speaker, Professor Andrew Boyd, and our President, Professor Hamidullah Marazi, our esteemed advisory board, and all our esteemed participants who joined us today and contributed to this meaningful dialogue. So we hope this session has enriched our understanding of civilizational dialogue and its relevance in the contemporary world. On behalf of Homa Civilization Dialogue and Harmony Foundation, I would like once again thank you and look forward to your participation in our future programs. With this, I formally conclude the session. Thank you, good evening, and good day to all of you. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
And I wish you see you again, inshallah.
I hope so.
Thank you. We will be inshallah in contact.